Before we create a site, there are some basics that need to be covered first. In this chapter, we will cover the benefits of using CSS, different ways of planning a site, better understand web measurements and sizes, and using CSS starter pages. Let's begin. So let's talk about planning to begin with. First of all, we need to understand both our client and the audience that the client is trying to reach. We can do that in a multitude of ways. So let's first start by opening up a file. So go to File and Open. In our project files, in our Chapter 2 folder, let's open up planning.html. Now this is one example of something that we might do planning a site design. This is a flowchart. It's just a very simple flowchart. I'm showing an index page and the pages that we have as our main navigation. What other URLs that we might need from those pages, and if we needed other pages, any secondary pages from there. Another example is a wireframe. So if we open up File and Open, in that same Chapter 2 folder, there's a file called wireframe.html. So once I have this open, because of my resolution at the moment, I don't see the whole entire page. So on the Mac, I'm going to choose Command and minus twice, just so I can see a little bit more of the page. On the PC, it would be Control and minus. So the page that we're looking at is just a really simple page. I did it in Fireworks, but it could really be done in a multitude of different programs. Balsamiq, all sorts of different programs can do a wireframe. So really what the wireframe is meant to be is something so that the client can take a look at the page without being concerned with colors and fonts, etc. We're really just trying to get a match on between the client and us on what they need and where the placement of the items are on the page. So what we have for this particular page is just basically where the logo placement is going to be, where our search bar is going to be, where our navigation is. We're going to have a little bit of a slideshow in the middle, and what text and what placement of that text is on the page. That way the client and ourselves can be basically in sync in what they need. We need to understand who the audience is, and that's part of our job to make sure that the accessibility and the usability of the page goes with what the client needs and what the audience needs both. So the next thing we need to make sure that we've got working right is understanding what page size that we're going to use then. Now we've got a wireframe, but a wireframe is just simply a fixed width on our page. So the next thing we need to understand or need to decide is the size of our page. So let's take a look at another file. Let's go to File and Open again. And back in Chapter 2, we have a file called Measurements. So far we've taken a look at making a flowchart. We've also taken a look at our wireframe and a different way of wireframing. And of course we could always use Dreamweaver to wireframe as well. Now we need to understand our browser size. What does the client want? How much content do they have versus what the audience actually needs from that particular website? First off, when we target a browser, we need to decide whether it's going to be 1024 by 768, 1280, 800 by 600. Who is using that particular website? What is the need? What content is there, etc. Inside of Dreamweaver as a designer, we also need to make sure that we are taking the browser parts into consideration. The navigation, the status bar, etc. So if we're going to target, for instance, a 1024 by 768 for our width, we need to make sure that we have a viewable area of at least 955 or 960. I have 960 down simply because it's a divisible number. If you'd like to take a look at more frameworks, 960.js is just one example of a framework. So next thing is page sizing. There are several different things that we can do for page sizing. So for instance, we have liquid. Liquid is a percentage-based sizing. So for instance, if I have in my CSS, say that I've got my width for my page to be 80%, then when the client, when the end user pulls out their browser, then my text will rewrap. All of my content is going to rewrap to fit the width of where they've pulled the browser out to. So I need to make sure that that is something that I have planned for in how my page is laid out. My next page sizing is elastic. That's also M-based. Now, we haven't talked about exactly what all the different types of measurements are just yet, when we will in just a second. But basically, it looks like a fixed width until they either do a Command plus on a Mac or a Control plus on a PC, which will increase the text size in their page. If this is also the size of my layout of my file, then the sizing for the layout will also increase when they do that as well, and not just the text. The next thing on my page is fixed, and I need to scroll down just a little bit to be able to see that. So fixed is an absolute measurement, so it's also a pixel-based measurement. It's not relative and it doesn't cascade, meaning that when I do a Control plus or a Command plus, the sizing for that won't increase as well as the text, just the text. So that's going to totally rewrap inside of my page, and I need to make sure that that's what I'm expecting. Will the client be maybe a little bit older and need to do a Control plus or a Command plus to be able to see the text? I need to make sure of those things before I decide on a sizing. Hybrid is next. A hybrid is a unique combination of both percentage and M-based. So for instance, I might have a navigation on the left or the right-hand side, and that might be M-based. The rest of my page might be percentage-based. So if the end user takes the browser and stretches it on the page, most of my page, the content, will stretch and rewrap, while the navigation will stay put unless they do a Command or a Control plus. Now let's discuss actual measurement values. Again, I'm going to scroll down just a little bit farther on my page so I can see. So we've got our percentage base, really excellent for specifying relative sizing. Inches, centimeters, and millimeters are measurements that we could use, but we really don't for the most part in web design. M's, now let's talk about M's. An M measurement is something that we use all the time in CSS. So we need to understand it completely. 1 M is equal to the current font size. So what the heck does that mean? That means that the end user in their browser, that's the default size. Most people don't know how to change that, so it is typically 16 pixels for the size that we have as a default. So if we have 1M equals the current font size, then that will be 16 pixels. But let's say we had just 12, so 12 points, then if 2M's is then going to be 24 points. It's a very useful measurement, but we need to make sure that we're defining everything properly first, and we will explain that in just a little bit. An X is also a measurement that we can use inside of CSS, and 1X is the X height of a font. It's usually about half the font size. Well, that's a measurement that really I would have to do the math with. So unless you're really great at math, that's not one that we typically use because it's not easy to figure that out and how to then use all of our measurements after that. The next one is points. Well, points is basically the same sort of measurement as a pixel, except for that's not something that we typically use with the browser. The browser is pixel-based, so if we use a point, that doesn't really match up all that well. So even though you can use it, we don't typically use it. Same thing with picas. Pica is a great measurement if you're laying out a magazine, but not necessarily a website. Pixels is a measurement that we actually use on the screen. It's dots on the computer screen. So that's a very important word that we are talking about. Pixels measure resolution. Let's scroll down just a little bit farther. So our tip is basically the M size that we use inside of Dreamweaver when we set up our CSS is typically set to 62.5%. So you might wonder why we're using a percentage there, and then we're going to use ems as a base for our measurement for our fonts for the rest of our page. Because browsers aren't all made exactly the same, I need to make sure that both Mac and PC and all the browsers are seeing just about basically the same size of font. So if I use a percentage based in my body to define the size for my font and then use an M in the rest of my page, most of the browsers and both the Mac and the PC will typically behave a little bit better in seeing the right size. So using my 62.5%, because the default browser is 16 pixels as, typically it's 16 pixels, then this makes it basically 10 pixels. Now 10 pixels is a whole lot easier to work with than trying to figure out the math of what their default browser is and what size that I actually want my fonts to be on my page. This really works more with just fonts. It works with all of my measurements in using ems. So I can use n as a multiplier in that way. So if I want a 12 pixel font, then I just do 1.2 m, and it's a whole lot easier to figure out. Now certainly that's just one example and one way that we'll be using. Just like everything else in the web and design, there are multiple ways to do everything. One thing you need to also remember is that ems, percentages, and x's are all relative length measures. So relative sizing equals cascade. We'll explain more about cascade in just a little bit, but it's a word that you need to make sure and remember at this point. Cascade is part of the cascading style sheets. So we also need to remember that IE, old IE, IE6, for instance, if you're still targeting IE6 at this point, and I'm sorry if you are, you need to make sure that if you're using pixels, that it doesn't resize, so it's not a relative size like an M. So for instance, if they do a Control Plus on a PC using IE6, my text will not get larger. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. Now that we've taken a look at measurements, let's open a couple of pages that we have in Chapter 2, and we can see exactly the difference between a liquid and a fixed layout. So go to File and Open. And inside of Chapter 2, I have a fixed sidebar.html. And I'm just going to hold down my Command key on the Mac, and it would be your Control key on the PC. And we're going to also open liquid sidebar.html. Let's take a look at our liquid sidebar.html first. Basically what these are a CSS starter page. Just so that you know where they are, let's take a look. So if I go under File and New, I get this screen up. This screen is great. I'm able to choose a new HTML page from here, CSS, ActionScript, PHP, .NET, ColdFusion, etc. If I choose HTML from here, I'm also able to see a layout. In my layout, I'm able to see a bunch of different types of files that I might want to open. So for instance, I am going to just click once on two-column fixed left sidebar header, and then we see a preview over in the right column as to exactly what that is. So I see that it's two columns, all widths in pixels, left sidebar, and it's going to include a header and a footer. Underneath that, over on the right column, I see that my doc type is going to be XHTML 1.0 transitional. It's a drop-down menu, so I can always change that. Next is my layout CSS. Now this is actually fairly important. This is by default going to add the CSS to the head tags of my page. The problem with this is that it's going to be on that page only, and if I copy that page and create another page from that page, then that is going to have that inside of the head tags as well. So for instance, if I change the H1 on my first page that I enabled, then if I don't change that on the second page, then I will have a different look and feel to the H1 tag from one page to the other, and that's not necessarily something that we would like. So I'm going to say instead of add to head, I'm going to choose create new file. And that way it will create a new external linked style sheet. And then I don't have to worry about it being specifically to a individual page. Then I can make the changes, and it could be 1,000 pages of a website, and I could change the font in just one place for all of those pages. That's the beauty of CSS. I can also enable in-context editing from here. Now, we really haven't talked about in-context editing yet, but basically it's a way for us to enable a place, instead of an actual template, a place that our client can then edit particular parts of our page. So if we don't want the client to worry about the navigation or any images on the page, we can just enable particular sections of the page to be in-context editing, and then the client is going to be able to edit that themselves. Click on Create. I need to decide where I'm going to save this. So instead of the actual name of this, I'm just going to choose fixed.css. If we fold open our files and I'm able to see all of my files here, you'll also see that I have a folder called Assets. Now, Assets is just a way to organize things. And if I double click on that, then I can see that I've got several other files now inside of that one. It's really all about organization, and we'll talk more about how to lay that out effectively in just a little bit. But basically, I have a CSS folder, a Flash folder, an Images folder, and a JavaScript folder. So double-click your CSS folder, and we'll go ahead and save that inside of there. Now that I have my page here, I need to make sure and save this first so that the CSS is also then linked to this particular page. If I start making changes in this page, then my pathing to that CSS file is not going to be correct. So we'll say File and Save, and I'm just going to call this Fixed as well, and we'll just leave it in Chapter 2. So when I'm using a CSS layout page, let's take a look at Split View first. And I'm just going to scroll down just a tiny bit here so I can see inside of my head tags, instead of all of my CSS in here, I have it linked. So I have a link file. It has where it's located at, my assets, CSS, fixed.css. Over in my panels, in my CSS panel, I'm going to fold up my insert panel and fold out my CSS panel so I can actually see what that is over here. So now I can see that I have body tags, UL, OL, DL, etc. And we'll explain more about what those things are in just a tiny little bit. But basically, we also need to understand the benefits of using CSS. CSS is a language that works alongside HTML. It was developed by the W3C, which is the World Wide Web Consortium. And a style sheet is really basically a collection of rules. If you've ever used styles in a program like InDesign or Quark, then this concept will be a little bit easier for you to understand. If not, that's okay. We'll still get it. CSS is used to modify the appearance of our HTML in a variety of different ways. So let's take a look at the style sheet that goes along with this. This also gives us a view of a related files view. If you've used an older version of Dreamweaver, then this will be a little bit different. Take a look at the top part of your window, and you'll see where our three buttons are that says Code, Split, and Design View. You'll also see a place where it says Source Code and Fixed CSS, the file that we have actually attached to this page. So if I do a right-click on Fixed.css, I can then open this as a separate file. So once I have this open, this is really still linked even though we have both the fix.html and our fix.css actually open. The CSS starter pages were developed to make sure that you can learn CSS really easily. So I see right away that I have a bunch of comments in my file. This is a great way for you to learn CSS. So maybe keeping the CSS file handy and your fix.html handy will be a great way for you to understand CSS. So let's go back and take a look at our page again. I'm going to go back to just my design view so I can see a little bit easier. And I'm going to go ahead and make this a little bit smaller so that I can see it. And again, that is a Command minus on the Mac and a Control minus on the PC. So even in our CSS starter pages, we have instructions. Tells you all about clearing methods, logo replacement, and backgrounds for this particular file. So I see that I have a place that I can put my logo at the top. I've got a header, I've got a sidebar, and no matter what size I would pull my browser window, if I were to open this in a browser window, I'm going to see this as a fixed size. It's not ever going to change. So it's all pixel based. If we take a look at our liquid sidebar.html, this is a percentage base file. So for instance, if we take a look at this in our browser, and I'm just going to click on this little button right here and preview in Firefox, because that is available on both Mac and the PC. I see that depending on where I stretch my browser window, my page will then rewrap and will resize. So if this is what I would like, I need to make sure and keep this into consideration. So let's go back to Dreamweaver. I'm going to go ahead and close these windows out so I can see Dreamweaver again. All right, so now we have a bunch of files open, so I can see that now in Dreamweaver all of these end up in little tabs at the top of my screen, so that makes it a whole lot easier to go back and forth, both on the PC and the Mac. The PC has always been like this, so if you've used Dreamweaver before on the PC, it won't look any different to you, but on the Mac, this is very much different, being able to see these in tabs now. I'm still able to see both my source view and my CSS view here. So this is my related files view. If I had a whole bunch of files in here, more CSS files, let's say I'm working on a WordPress site, and I have related files that are both CSS and PHP files, over on the right-hand side here, I have a little tab that I'm able to see. I can do a custom filter, show all files, or maybe I want to just see the related files, the PHP files, and not the CSS files. I can do a custom filter on those related files over here. So far we've taken a look at planning and how to do a flowchart, really as a first point of interest to make sure both you and the client are aware of what pages are going to be involved, our main pages, secondary pages, third level pages, etc., what links and what information might be on those pages. That can be done in a multitude of ways. The flowchart can be done inside of Dreamweaver, it can be done in Illustrator, Fireworks, etc. It really doesn't matter where, as long as you're sharing it with the client so both of you are on the exact same level. So next we're going to be taking a look at how to put together a Dreamweaver site. To better understand the benefits of using CSS, we also need to understand it a little bit better. And the Cascade part of Style Sheets is where we need to start. There are three basic parts to using CSS. We can have an inline style. So around a particular tag, like a paragraph tag, we could put, for the P, we would have P space, we could actually start typing style equals and actually put our color or our font or whatever we want inside of that particular style. The problem with inline styling is specifically around that individual piece, and if I wanted to change that later on, I would have to go and open that page again to be able to change it. The next part is embedded styling. Remember when we went to File, New, and we opened, so let's just do that again so we can talk about that one more time. So File and New, and we have our starter pages. Over on the right-hand column, it said Add to Head. Now this would be adding it to my head tags. And again, the problem with this is that it is on that specific page and not on a multitude of pages. I'm just going to go ahead and cancel. So for this particular page that I happen to have up, which is my liquid sidebar that we used in the last lesson, I can already see that I already have a style sheet attached to it. So I have a 2-column liquid right header.css style sheet. Now this is an external style sheet. We saw in our source code, I'm going to go ahead and click back on my source code to take a look at that here I have on line 6 a link that is linking to that specific style sheet. The benefit of using an external style sheet is that I can style a 1,000-page website in just one place. Now, I might end up having many more style sheets than just this one style. For instance, I can have a style sheet that's also for print or for mobile or for even presentation style, but let's concentrate on the external style at the moment. So for instance, I can have a paragraph. If I style my paragraph in my style sheet, then when the client comes back later and says that they would like that particular paragraph style to be maybe the font be a little smaller or a little bigger or even a different font entirely, then we have just one place that we can go to make those changes at. So working with a 1,000-page website is really as simple as making sure that I understand where the styles are at and targeting those particular styles in my style sheet to make it easier for me to work with 1,000 pages. But even if you have a small site, making sure that you have an external style in place that you can change easily will make your life a lot simpler. There's another part to the cascade that we don't normally even think about. Now, the cascade actually starts at the browser and the end user. So for instance, within our style sheets, let's say that we have a heading applied. If I'm looking at the page on my screen, I see instructions. And instructions has a style applied to it. So if I click on it, I see that it's a heading 1. So let's say that we have 3 different things of our styles, so we understand the cascade a little bit better. If I have this heading 1 in green, let's say in our external style, if it's in red embedded style, and if it's blue in our inline style, then our inline style takes precedence over our embedded and our external style. If I don't have something styled inline, then anything that I have styled embedded takes over what is styled in an external style. And then my external style is last. So if I want to override a particular element on my page in CSS, I can use either embedded or inline, and that will override something very specific. But again, you wouldn't want to use that very often because you have to come back to that particular page to change the style, which is why external styles are used most often. So we need to understand our rules just a little bit better first. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to go ahead and take a look at our 2-column style sheet, and I will just go to code view so we can take a better look at it. So within an actual style sheet, we have several different types of elements, and these are called rules. And within our rule, we have our properties and our values for that particular rule. So for instance, we'll just take a look at the body tag that we have to begin with. So we can style tags like our body, our H1, our H2, links, etc. We can also style elements that we have specifically on our page. For instance, if I wanted a particular bit of text to be blue, I can make what's called a class style, and then I would have to highlight that and make that particular little bit of text blue through that class style. Again, it's in my style sheet, so I can go back and change it to red if I would prefer that to be red later on, and I don't have to actually click on the actual page itself. We also have something called a compound style. So for instance, if I have a footer on my page, and I may not want the paragraph inside of that footer to be the same size or maybe even the same color as the rest of my page. So if I take a look at the design view again for that particular page, I see that I have some links over on the side. This is a really great example of why I may not want that to be the same globally. So for instance, I have an unordered list is what's made up for this particular navigation. So I have a UL, li, and it also has a value applied to it. I'm going to take a look at the code for just a minute. And my source code, scroll to find my little navigation there on the side, and I see that I have a UL tag. So that's my unordered list. That's what the UL is. I have an LI for my link 1, and now there's just a pound inside of the actual link itself, which is really just saying, please replace this with whatever the link is going to be eventually. It means nothing other than it allows me to style that particular link. And then I finish off with my tag. Now, if we take a look at the design, we see that that doesn't look like a typical unordered list. So in my CSS rules over on the side, if I scroll down to that particular area, so there's my ul.nav, ul.nav.li, etc. And this is what's called a compound. So I am saying the UL, and inside of that, what the A tag is then styled at, the visited, hover state, active state, etc., all within the same rule, so that only that section looks different than the rest of my page. If I put a regular list item on my page, it's going to look totally different than that, and that's a great example of a compound style. So we have tags, class styles, and compound styles that we use most often. And again, let's take a look at the actual style itself. So body then is my tag, and I don't have to have anything in front of it to declare it. So I have my body. Inside of my curly braces, I have the property and the value listed, and I can have several things. So I see that I've got my font size, my font family, what my background color is going to be, what my margin and my padding is going to be, and my text color for a global default for my body tag. We'll go more in depth into what CSS does in just a little bit.